In 1941, a community cookbook dropped its entire scratch soup section, not because the recipes failed, but because a corporate sponsor paid to replace them. During the Great Depression, with unemployment at 25%, women across America kept families alive on soups costing as little as 2 cents a bowl. They weren't cooking poor, they were cooking smart, turning bones, scraps, and foraged greens into meals that modern research confirms outperformed the canned products that were designed to erase them. These recipes never appeared in glossy cookbooks. They were penciled into margins and whispered between neighbors as survival knowledge. 25 of those forgotten soups nearly vanished for good, and understanding who buried them starts with a single simmering bone. A widow in coastal Maine began each morning with a single beef bone saved in a tin on the windowsill. For her, bone broth was not a luxury, but a lifeline. It simmered for hours until the kitchen filled with the scent of salt and marrow, coaxing every bit of collagen from the bone. At 2 cents a bowl, this broth became the base for the week, sometimes thickened with potato skins, sometimes stretched with wild onion greens. She learned to scrape the pot clean, knowing that every trace of flavor mattered. In a Chicago tenement, a Polish grandmother kept a notebook with tomato stains on the corners and rice measurements written in shorthand. Her tomato rice soup started with canned tomatoes, sold at a nickel per tin, mixed with water and a handful of rice. Each grain counted, never wasted. She added a pinch of sugar to cut the acid and let the pot bubble on a low flame while she mended shirts. The rice swelled, soaking up every drop, turning a thin soup into a meal that could feed 6 children for less than a quarter. Neighbors would knock, asking for a ladleful, and she would scribble substitutions in the margins. Barley if no rice. Add carrot peel. On the Kansas plains, a homesteader's cast-iron pot rarely left the stove. Potato and leek soup was her answer to the endless wind and dust. 5 pounds of potatoes, 2 leeks, a spoonful of lard, and water from the well were the building blocks. She mashed the potatoes into the broth, letting the starch thicken the soup until it could stand a spoon upright. If leeks were scarce, she would use wild onions or even the green tops of turnips. The pot fed a family and half the neighbors, with leftovers reheated for breakfast. At 3 cents a bowl, it was a lesson in extracting comfort from the earth itself. These soups were not born of mere necessity. They were crafted through daily acts of calculation and care, stretching scraps, swapping starches, building flavor from almost nothing. The simmering, the scraping, the penciled notes in a battered book were all evidence of a quiet intelligence that turned hardship into nourishment. While the world outside measured worth in dollars, these kitchens measured it in bowls that never ran empty. In a coal town in eastern Kentucky, a miner's wife greeted the dawn by fishing a smoked ham hock from its salt-packed crock. The hock, bought for pennies at the end of the month, was never meant to be eaten whole. Instead, it was the soul of her bean soup, dropped into a pot with dried navy beans, onions, and water, left to simmer until the smoky scent drifted through the house. She served it with cornbread, the hock scraped clean, the fat rendered into flavor that carried a meal for days. Each bowl cost less than 3 cents, but the taste was rich enough to make neighbors trade for a ladleful or offer up a jar of pickled beets in return. In the Italian quarter of St. Louis, an old butcher's daughter stirred oxtail into a bubbling cauldron of lentils and carrots. Oxtail was the cut nobody else wanted, sold for a nickel a pound, often thrown in free with a larger order. She browned it first, coaxing every drop of marrow from the bone, then added whatever root vegetables the grocer had marked down that morning. The stew grew thick and glossy, the oxtail breaking down into ribbons of meat. For her family, this was not a meal of shame, but a celebration of thrift, a way to honor the animal and the work of her father's hands. 10 bowls for 31 cents, each one a lesson in using what others overlooked. Along the Maine coast, a fisherman's mother watched the tides and the cornfields with equal care. When the harvest came in, she combined sweet corn scraped from the cob, diced potatoes, and a splash of milk into a chowder that was both simple and bright. Salt pork gave it depth when she could spare it. Otherwise, she leaned on the sweetness of the corn and the starch of the potatoes to thicken the broth. She swapped ears of corn with a neighbor for a handful of clams or a few eggs. The chowder, at just under 3 cents a serving, was a summer luxury and a winter staple, the kind of meal that tasted of the land and the sea together. These soups and stews were more than recipes. They were survival strategies, shaped by the seasons, the bargains at the market, and the silent agreements between women who traded flavor for comfort. Preservation and barter kept kitchens afloat long before canned soup commercials promised a shortcut. In these pots, thrift met technique, and every bowl told the story of a household's quiet ingenuity. In a tenement kitchen in Harlem, a Jamaican immigrant mother laid out her day's challenge. She had to feed 4 children and herself with the coins left in her apron pocket. She went to the market at dawn, bypassing the plucked chickens and heading straight for the crate of feet, piled high, overlooked, and sold for pennies. For 3 cents, she filled a brown paper sack with enough chicken feet to flavor a pot. At home, she scrubbed the feet, clipped the nails, and simmered them with onion skins, celery tops, and a pinch of thyme. The broth grew rich and golden, thickened by the gelatin that seeped from the bones and skin. She picked out the feet before serving, leaving behind a soup that could stretch to 5 bowls, each costing barely more than 1/3 of a cent. Chickenfoot soup was never written into glossy cookbooks. Its recipe traveled in quiet ways, a whispered tip in the hallway, a scribbled note on the back of a church flyer, a memory handed from mother to daughter. The intelligence behind it was invisible to anyone who measured only by cuts of meat or the price of a can. These women were not cooking poor, they were cooking smart, extracting nourishment from scraps that others dismissed as waste. Every bowl was a lesson in how to turn what the market ignored into what the family needed most. But by 1934, a new message began to fill the airwaves and newspaper columns. Campbell's ran full-page ads in the New York Times promising a complete meal in every can, no extra calories, no extra cost. The ad copy framed convenience as modern, urging mothers to trade hours at the stove for the twist of a can opener. Another headline asked why simmer all day. Open a can, heat, and feed the family. The price per serving was never lower than homemade, but the promise was different. Less labor, more time. A taste of progress for the modern kitchen. The contrast was sharp. In kitchens across the country, mothers still saved bones and feet, still penciled substitutions in the margins of battered notebooks. Yet each new ad chipped away at the idea that thrift and intelligence were forms of domestic know-how. The food industry began to write its own story of what counted as good cooking, pushing the quiet genius of Depression-era women further from view. The erasure did not happen all at once. It started with a slogan, a photograph of a tidy can, a promise that convenience was the future, and old ways belonged to the past. In a crowded flat above a bakery on Milwaukee Avenue, a Polish matriarch built her cabbage soup from the ground up, beginning with a head of green cabbage and a chunk of salt pork wrapped in butcher paper. She sliced the cabbage thin, letting the crisp leaves tumble into a battered pot, then followed with carrots, potatoes, and a splash of vinegar saved from the bottom of a pickle jar. The vinegar, sharp and bright, transformed the humble broth into something almost celebratory, a tang that cut through the starch and fat, coaxing out every hidden note of flavor. At just over 3.5 cents per bowl, this soup was a marvel of thrift and chemistry. The salt pork, bought for pennies at the end of the week, was never eaten outright. Instead, it lent its smoky essence to the broth, and the rind would be fished out, dried, and used again the next day. Across the Appalachian ridges, another household greeted winter with a similar ritual. Here, a mountain woman relied on the alchemy of preservation, salt, smoke, and acid, to turn what little she had into meals that lasted. She hung cabbage heads from the rafters, letting them cure in the cold, and tucked away crocks of sauerkraut for the lean months. When the time came, she simmered the cabbage with a heel of salt pork and whatever root vegetables were left in the cellar. The result was a soup that tasted of both hardship and hope, tart, warming, and deeply nourishing. Each bowl, costing less than 4 cents, was a testament to the power of preservation and patience. These women understood that acid and smoke were more than flavors. They were tools for survival. Fermentation kept vegetables edible through months of scarcity, while cured pork stretched its worth across a week's worth of meals. Every drop of vinegar and every wisp of smoke represented a kind of kitchen wisdom, passed quietly from one generation to the next. In these pots, thrift was not deprivation, but invention, and every bowl held the memory of a mother's careful calculation. Science would later confirm what these cooks already knew. Preservation was not just about saving food, but about saving families. On an Iowa farm, children gathered at the kitchen table with bowls of dried peas, their small hands working to shell each one into a battered enamel pot. The peas, bought in bulk at just over 4 cents a pound, could sit on a pantry shelf for months, waiting for the next cold spell or lean week. When the time came, a slab of fatback was sliced thin and dropped into the pot, the sizzle and scent promising more than just calories. A handful of diced onion, a pinch of salt, and water from the well completed the base. The pot simmered for hours, the peas softening and the fatback melting into the broth, turning what started as a handful of hard, dry pulses into a soup that could feed 10 for less than 4 cents a bowl. Across town, a school teacher, herself the daughter of Hungarian immigrants, relied on lentils to fill her students' bellies. She kept a sack of green lentils in the supply closet, bought for 3 cents a pound at the feed store. Lentils needed no overnight soak and cooked quickly, making them a favorite for days when the schoolhouse stove burned low and the children's faces were pale from winter. She would start with a pot of water, a chopped carrot, and a spoonful of lard, then pour in the lentils and let them bubble until the broth thickened and the aroma filled the classroom. Each bowl, costing just under 4 cents, delivered warmth, protein, and enough fiber to keep hunger at bay until supper. These pulses, peas and lentils, were more than cheap filler. They were a kind of insurance, stashed in every farmhouse and school pantry, ready to turn scarcity into sustenance. Commodity prices from 1935 list a bowl of pea or lentil soup at just $0.039 to $0.041, a fraction of a day's wage, yet enough to keep a family or a class on their feet. In these kitchens, thrift was not a mark of failure, but a sign of practical wisdom, and every pot of soup was a quiet act of resilience. A homestead mother in Nebraska gathered turnip greens at dawn, her apron already stained with the memory of last year's drought. She moved through the garden, snipping wild dandelion and lamb's quarters, her eye trained by hunger and habit. In her battered pot, she combined the greens with a handful of diced turnip, a potato if she had one, and water drawn from the well. Salt was a luxury, bacon fat a windfall. The soup simmered on the back of the stove, filling the house with the scent of earth and bitter green. She served it in chipped bowls, each portion costing less than 5 cents. a meal that owed its life to what the land and her hands could provide. Turnip green soup, like so many foraged dishes, was built on knowledge that never made it into glossy cookbooks. Recipes traveled through whispers and handwritten notes, passed from mother to daughter, neighbor to neighbor. The intelligence behind these meals was quiet but profound, knowing which wild greens to pick, how to balance their flavors, how to coax every mineral from a pot of simmering leaves. This was not just thrift, it was survival science, practiced in kitchens that measured success in full bellies, not in dollars or prestige. Decades later, nutrition researchers have circled back to these old recipes, trying to quantify what Depression-era cooks understood by instinct. While no single study can capture the full story, a 2024 review of homemade versus canned soups found that bowls made from scratch routinely deliver 15 to 40% more protein and minerals than their processed counterparts. The difference comes from whole ingredients, wild greens, fresh beans, real bones. Canned soups, stripped by industrial processing and diluted for shelf life, cannot match the nutrient density of a pot made from scratch. For the homestead mother, this meant her turnip green soup did not just fill her children, it fortified them, providing iron, calcium, and protein at a price of just over 4 cents per bowl. This evidence gives weight to what women already knew. The wisdom scribbled in notebook margins and traded over backyard fences was not just practical, but scientifically sound. The real question is not why these foods disappeared from the table, but why so much knowledge, so much resilience was allowed to fade from memory when the science now confirms its worth. Mock turtle soup was a dish born of longing and invention, a way to conjure the taste of luxury from the humblest scraps. In a Cincinnati boarding house, the cook started with a calf's foot, some hard-boiled eggs, and a splash of vinegar, simmering the pot until the broth turned rich and brown. She knew her clientele, salesmen and clerks who could not afford the real thing, but craved a taste of elegance. The recipe, jotted on a slip of paper and tucked behind the sugar bin, listed every ingredient down to the last cent. At just under 5 cents a bowl, 4.5 cents by the ledger, this soup offered the illusion of prosperity, even as the real cost was measured in the hours spent coaxing flavor from bone and peel. When beef shank was too dear, she would swap in veal scraps or even a spoonful of bouillon, adapting the recipe with each week's market prices. For the cook, the real skill was not in following a recipe, but in reading the room and stretching the budget until the numbers lined up. Across town, a city relief organizer faced a different problem: how to feed hundreds, not just a handful, without letting costs spiral beyond what the municipal ledger could bear. The solution came in the form of vegetable beef soup, an industrial pot that swallowed up carrots, potatoes, barley, and the cheapest cuts of beef, diced so fine that every spoonful promised a taste of meat. The city canteen's ledger, stamped and initialed, listed the cost at 4.7 cents a bowl. Here, the recipe was less a matter of taste than of arithmetic. How many mouths, how many pounds, how many gallons of water to keep the line moving and the bowls full. Adaptability was the watchword. When carrots ran short, turnips filled the gap. When beef was scarce, a few marrow bones and a pinch more barley took their place. The relief kitchen's cook, once a restaurant chef, now measured success in the number of children who left with full bellies. Both kitchens, one private and one public, relied on the same quiet ingenuity. Whether scribbled in the margin of a battered notebook or scaled up on a city ledger, these soups were more than recipes. They were acts of survival, shaped by the need to make something nourishing out of almost nothing. The difference lay in the scale, not the skill. The boarding house cook traded in illusion. The relief organizer traded in sheer volume. Each adapted, substituted, and calculated, proving that resilience was not just a matter of what went into the pot, but of who held the ladle and how far they could stretch a dollar. In rural Indiana, late spring brings dandelion greens, bitter, mineral-rich, and stubbornly resilient. A forager, boots caked with mud, knows which leaves to gather before the sun burns off their tenderness. She rinses them in pump water and drops them into a pot with lard and a pinch of salt if she has it. The soup is grassy and sharp, a taste her children resist, but she reminds them these same greens once kept their grandmother alive through 2 winters. At less than 5 cents a bowl, the cost is measured in footsteps and memory. In Mississippi, a sharecropper's wife stands over a battered pot, chicken neck and rice her only luxuries. Her hands, rough from cotton fields, work with quiet precision. The neck simmers until the broth clouds, rice added slowly, starch and gelatin coaxed from bone. She picks the neck clean, returns every scrap to the pot. Wild onion or pepper, if the garden allows, deepen the flavor. The soup is silky, filling, and costs just over 5 cents a bowl. In her ledger, she records the price, $0.049 to $0.053 per serving. But what endures is the method, how to stretch flavor, how to make do, how to turn scarcity into sustenance. On a Tampa stoop, a Cuban mother tends black beans in a dented enamel pot. Her secret is spice, bay leaf, garlic, the last of the cumin sent from Havana. She fries onion and green pepper in saved bacon fat, stirring the mixture into the beans, letting the aroma drift through the hallway. Rice is cooked separately, ready to stretch the meal. Each bowl, just over 5 cents, is glossy and fragrant, a taste of home, carried across water and hardship. She transforms a bag of beans and a handful of rice into comfort, her recipes passed not on paper, but in whispers, surviving because they work. These meals were more than food. They were repositories of field wisdom, bone wisdom, spice wisdom, knowledge carried by women who measured success in bowls emptied and children fed. Industry would later dismiss these dishes as old-fashioned. In these kitchens, every simmering pot was a lesson in survival, every recipe a record of intelligence that endures. In the hills outside Jefferson City, a Missouri widow stood at her kitchen table with 3 children watching. She tore yesterday's bread into ragged hunks, the crusts so dry they snapped in her hands. Nothing in her house went to waste. Not even the heel of a loaf, not even the crumbs at the bottom of the tin. Bread soup was her answer to hunger and thrift. A pot of boiling water, a pinch of salt, and the last of the onion ends. The bread, stale and hard, softened in the broth, soaking up every drop, turning thin water into sustenance. If she had a carrot, she would shave it in. If she had a bone, she would drop it in for flavor, then fish it out before serving. On the rare days when milk was left, she would pour in a splash, watching the broth cloud and thicken. A bowl cost less than 6 cents, 5.5 cents according to the county ledger, and cheaper than a cup of coffee at the depot. The widow's hands moved with practiced care, tearing and dropping, stirring and tasting, her children's eyes following every motion. Every scrap of bread was used, every crust a promise that tomorrow's meal might come together if nothing else could be found. She had learned this from her own mother, who had learned it from hers. When flour was scarce and yeast a luxury, bread became currency, and soup became the bank that kept the family fed. Neighbors sometimes traded for a bowl, offering a spoonful of lard or a clutch of wild greens in return. The recipe was never written down. It was lived day by day, in kitchens where waste was unthinkable and invention was survival. The price of bread in 1935 hovered around 8 cents a pound. But in this house, every penny counted. The trick was to stretch a single loaf across a week, turning what others might toss into the heart of a meal. As the soup simmered, the smell of broth and bread filled the room, warm and familiar. When the pot was scraped clean, the sound of a spoon against enamel echoed through the kitchen, a small, defiant proof that nothing had been left behind. Onions, once overlooked as humble fare, became the foundation of Depression-era kitchens. In a crowded Lower East Side apartment, an immigrant cook began with thinly sliced onions, a smear of lard, and a battered pot. She watched over the stove, stirring as the onions softened and darkened, their scent drifting through the building. Patience was her secret, slow caramelization until the onions glowed like old brass. Water, salt, and sometimes a dash of vinegar followed. Each bowl, golden and steaming, cost just $0.057 according to the market sheets. It was a meal built on time, not money. In Oklahoma City, a church kitchen steward worked with what she had: a smoked ham bone left from Sunday, and a can of hominy. The bone, stripped of meat, still gave its smoky echo to the broth. She added chopped onions and black pepper, letting the stew simmer until the hominy swelled and burst with flavor. For $0.059 a bowl, her stew could feed a dozen, stretching one bone across several meals. Both cooks mastered the art of layering flavor from scraps. Onions, browned with care, brought a depth that rivaled meat. Hominy, rooted in native and southern traditions, turned thin broth into something hearty. These recipes were not written down, they were passed by word of mouth, learned by watching, perfected by need. Thrift here was a quiet kind of genius. Corporate consolidation changed the very shape of American kitchens. In the late 1930s, mergers between grocery retailers and canning companies accelerated, quietly redrawing the lines of influence over what families cooked and how recipes survived. FTC annual reports from 1939 document the acquisition of independent canneries by grocery chains, a move that shifted not just supply chains, but also the flow of recipe sponsorships. By 1941, community cookbooks that once brimmed with scratch soup recipes, bean broths, potato stews, wild greens dumplings, showed a new pattern. The revised edition of the American Home Community Cookbook dropped its entire section on homemade soups, replacing it with a page of sponsored recipes that called for brand-name canned goods. The hand-lettered margins and neighbor-sourced substitutions vanished, replaced by glossy endorsements and uniform directions. Yet, the erasure was never complete. In a small Alabama town, a grandmother stood in her kitchen, mustard greens piled high on her cutting board. She pinched flour and lard into soft dumplings, dropping them into a simmering pot of greens and ham hock. The recipe had never been published, only spoken and scribbled in the back of a church bulletin. Each dumpling floated to the surface, clouds of steam rising as she tasted for salt. Her granddaughter watched, memorizing the motions, the whispered advice. Use wild greens if you find them. Bacon fat if there is no ham. The soup was thick, peppery, and cost less than 6 cents a bowl. No brand, no label, just survival knowledge. Even as corporate recipes filled the shelves, these acts of resistance continued in quiet kitchens, each pot a living memory, each bowl a refusal to forget. In a cramped Seattle laundry, a Chinese immigrant mother cracked 2 eggs that cost 6.5 cents for both, into a battered bowl. She whisked them with water and salt and poured the mixture into simmering tomato broth. The eggs set instantly, forming delicate ribbons. Her tomato egg drop soup, bright and filling, cost just over 6 cents a bowl. The process was swift, the timing precise, squeezed between folding shirts and answering the bell for another bundle. For her, speed was necessity, not luxury. Each bowl was a small victory, a way to stretch a splurge into sustenance. Nearby, a Ukrainian grandmother kept garlic braided and hung above her basement stove, each bulb saved from the autumn market. She started her potato and garlic soup with a scrap of lard and a handful of diced potatoes. The real transformation came from garlic, crushed and fried until fragrant, turning starch and water into something that lingered in the air and memory. The aroma drifted down the hallway, sharp and inviting. Garlic was cheap by the pound, but in her hands, it was priceless. Each bowl, just over 6 cents, offered warmth and a reminder of distant fields. Both women counted pennies and seconds, investing in flavor with small, practiced gestures. Their weekday soups, born of thrift and speed, carried the knowledge of survival, passed quietly, bowl by bowl, across generations. In a cellar lined with stone jars and vinegar crocks, a German mother reached for her last reserve, a crock of homemade sauerkraut fermented through months of patience and quiet calculation. She ladled the sharp, briny cabbage into a battered pot, added water, a sliver of pork rind if she had it, and let the soup simmer until the tang filled the house. Each bowl, at just under 7 cents, delivered more than calories. It restored what winter and want had taken, offering probiotics and vitamins that science would praise decades later. The recipe was never written down, only murmured in the low German of the cellar, handed from mother to daughter as a promise that nothing would spoil if you knew how to preserve. A few blocks away, in an urban tenement, the bean pot never left the stovetop. Navy beans, pintos, or whatever was cheapest that week, soaked overnight and simmered with onion skins and maybe a carrot end if luck held. The beans were democratic. Every family could afford them. Every neighbor knew a trick to make them tender. At 6.9 cents per bowl, the math was simple, but the knowledge was deep. Beans stretched across cultures and kitchens, feeding the city and the countryside alike. The pot was always shared, sometimes with a neighbor who had nothing left but hope. In these final bowls, the story of Depression cooking comes full circle, not just making do, but making better. Cooking smart, not just cooking poor. The legacy endures in every simmering pot, every recipe scribbled on a scrap, every meal that kept a family alive. What we call scraps today were, for millions, the raw materials of survival intelligence. These were recipes shaped by ingenuity, not just scarcity. Industry narratives may have buried these women's kitchen wisdom, but their resourcefulness still matters. As food insecurity rises in the modern era, the quiet brilliance of Depression-era home cooks offers a reminder. Resilience isn't a relic. It is a necessity we may need to remember. Share your thoughts or your family's recipes below.